Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 38. Continuing with a piece that I already read here, but after Jesus got into a boat with his disciples, he went to the district of Dalmanutha. Then the Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, asking for a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation look for a sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to this generation." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to take bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. And Jesus ordered them, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." So they began to discuss with one another about having no bread. When he learned of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you arguing about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Have your hearts been hardened? Though you have eyes, don't you see? And though you have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They replied, 12. "When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you pick up?" They replied, 7. Then he said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Then they came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to Jesus and asked him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him outside the village. Then he spit on his eyes, placed his hands on his eyes, and asked, "Do you see anything?" Regaining his sight, he said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." Then Jesus and his disciples went to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said, "John the Baptist, or others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and experts in the law, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke openly about this. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But after turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not setting your mind on God's interest, but on man's." Then Jesus called the crowd along with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to become my follower, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. For what benefit is it for a person to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his life? What can a person give in exchange for his life? For if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." It's interesting. Jesus gets in the boat, comes over to Dalmanutha. The Pharisees argue with him about a sign. Then he gets in the boat and goes to the other side. Done arguing with you guys. But that gives an interesting picture, doesn't it? That the Pharisees are just ready to come pick on him. Yeah. So, seeking from him a sign from heaven, which I find astounding because of all of the stuff that he's already done. In the mind of the Pharisees, this was not a request for another miracle of the type Jesus had already done. They asked for a dramatic sign from the sky, something similar to Elijah's fire from heaven. Testing him. This was not a friendly encounter. The word tested could be translated tempted. The Pharisees tempted Jesus to perform a miraculous sign just as Satan tempted him to do so in the wilderness. Yeah, throw yourself down from here, for it's written that the angels will bear you up. He sighed deeply in his spirit. The attack and the unbelief, it showed distressed Jesus. He was amazed at the unbelief and audacity of these religious leaders. The sigh, physical, its cause, spiritual, a sense of irreconcilable enmity, invincible unbelief, and coming doom. Invincible unbelief indeed. Here you have in front of them the very creator of the universe in bodily form. And they're like, show us a sign. It's just like, I think it was Richard Dawkins in an interview that said essentially that even if he saw writing in the sky that said, Richard Dawkins, I am God, believe in me, he would think that he was going crazy or, yeah. And so that bit from Bruce here about invincible unbelief sounds really apt in that we can just create an invincible shell of skepticism around us and not believe, even if the real thing is in front of us. In this case, God himself coming to us. And yeah. God himself coming on a rescue mission to save us, and it's just like, well, prove you exist. And it's just like, oh gosh, please. No sign shall be given to this generation. Jesus refused because his miracles are not done with the intention of convincing hardened unbelievers. Instead, Jesus did miracles to show the power of God in the context of mercy. Those who believe that if people see enough signs they will come to faith presume to know more than Jesus did. He condemned the generation who sought a sign. Yeah. And I've had several people say to me, why doesn't Jesus act more visibly in this day and time? I think coming in the same vein as these Pharisees here who say, show us a sign from heaven. The implication being that if God worked more visibly, more like he did in the times of the Exodus, then they would believe in him. But it wasn't enough for the people of the Exodus to all believe in God then, and it won't be enough for those with hardened unbelief to believe now. He left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. And he charged them, saying, take heed of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. This leaven wasn't merely yeast, but a pinch of dough left over from the previous batch, as in the making of sourdough bread. This was how bread was commonly leavened in the ancient world. And a little pinch of dough from the old lump could make a whole new lump of dough rise and puff up. So the work of leaven was considered an illustration of the work of sin and pride. The presence of a little can corrupt a large amount. Take heed, beware. Jesus essentially said, beware of the evil way the Pharisees and Herod think of the kingdom of the Messiah, for in a short time I will reveal the truth of it to you. Both Herod and the Pharisees idealized the kingdom as domineering power and authority. Herod saw it more as a political power and authority, and the Pharisees saw it as more spiritual power and authority, but they still saw the kingdom in this high-minded way. Yeah. Yeah, and reading this through the other day, I thought it was kind of an interesting dichotomy between the Pharisees, that is kind of this very strict legalistic Judaism, and Hellenism, that is kind of this adapted, morphed Judaism for coinciding with the Greek world. And Jesus was pointing towards both of them being wrong. And being a corrupting influence. And I think it's a good warning for the Christian that we can't embrace the teachings of this world type thing in the cultures of this world, even though they tend to be popular. But we need to walk right down the middle of believing and obeying Jesus, even if it cuts cross-culturally. And I would say especially when it cuts cross-culturally. But the disciples didn't get it. It is because we have no bread. When Jesus spoke of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, the disciples didn't relate it to a spiritual idea at all. All they could think of was the bread that goes in the stomach, not the bread that goes into the soul. Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Jesus confronted his disciples over their lack of understanding. From this we know that they could have done better than this. They could have understood more if they applied themselves more. Do you not remember? Their understanding should have been based on seeing what Jesus already did. We can always take the past faithfulness of God as a promise for his continued love and care. This is one of the situations where we wish we had a recording of Jesus' words to hear what tone of voice he used. Was it a tone communicating anger, concern, or frustration? We know that even when Jesus confronted his disciples, he did it in love. For this blind man, he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him. Adam Clarke had an interesting perspective on this. It is likely that this was done merely to separate the eyelids, as in certain cases of blindness, they are found always gummed together. It required a miracle to restore the sight, and this was done in consequence of Christ having laid his hands upon the blind man. It required no miracle to separate the eyelids, and therefore natural means only were employed. This was done by rubbing them with spittle. Yeah. I know sometimes in the case of cats, particularly like strays and barn cats, they tend to get their eyes gummed up. So I could definitely see them being gummed shut. So Jesus engaged in the practical work of prying this man's eyes open. He put his hands on his eyes again. This is the only gradual or progressive healing described in the ministry of Jesus. It is another example of the variety of healing methods Jesus used. Jesus probably chose this method at this time as an illustration to his disciples, showing them that their spiritual blindness, shown in the previous passage, will be healed, but only gradually. Yeah. Just from some of the attempts that we've had today for restoring, I think, hearing or blindness in some cases, you have the signals being communicated to the brain, but them not necessarily being understood. So in this case, the man saw men walking like trees. So he could see something, but it wasn't clear to him what it was. And that's because the brain wasn't used to interpreting and identifying these things as people and the objects as different objects. And that sort of information is trained in the brain over our whole lives. Separate, very much separate from the physical act of being able to see. It is a secondary step of being able to understand and parse what it is that the sensory organ is actually communicating. So it's interesting that Jesus did that gradually. First the sight itself, and then the understanding. Who do men say that I am? Jesus did not ask this question because he didn't know who he was, or because he had a twisted dependence on the opinions of others. He asked this question as an introduction to a more important follow-up question. John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. People who thought that Jesus was John the Baptist didn't know much about him, and they didn't know that Jesus and John had ministered at the same time. But both John and Elijah were national reformers who stood up to the corrupt rulers of their day. Perhaps in seeing Jesus as John the Baptist or Elijah, people hoped for a political Messiah who would overthrow the corrupt powers oppressing Israel. But who do you say that I am? It was fine for the disciples to know what others thought about Jesus, but Jesus had to ask them as individuals what they believed about Jesus. You are the Christ. Peter knew the opinion of the crowd. Though complimentary toward Jesus wasn't accurate. Jesus was much more than John the Baptist or Elijah or a prophet or a good man. He was more than a national reformer, more than a miracle worker, more than a prophet. Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. Calling Jesus the Messiah was right on the mark, but easily misunderstood. In the thinking of most people in Jesus' day, the Messiah was a political and national superman. Toward the close of the Old Testament period, the word anointed assumed a special meaning. It denoted the ideal king, anointed and empowered by God to deliver his people and establish his righteous kingdom. And the Jews themselves often believed in two separate messiahs, one conquering king and one suffering servant. And they definitely wanted the conquering king to save them from the Roman Empire and the oppression that they were experiencing from them. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke his words openly. This word openly. This was an unbelievable shock to anyone expecting or hoping that Jesus was the national and political Messiah. It is as if an American presidential candidate announced toward the end of his campaign that he would go to Washington to be rejected and executed. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter's intent was love for Jesus, but he was unwittingly used of Satan. You don't have to be demon-possessed for Satan to use you, and we need to be on guard lest we are unwittingly used. Matthew 16:17-19 gives us a little more insight into this passage. We read there that after Peter made the confession of faith, recorded in Mark 8:29, "You are the Christ," Jesus then answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Jesus went on to further build up Peter after that complimentary word. It's not hard to see Peter following these steps. Peter confessed Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus complimented Peter, telling him that God revealed this to him. Jesus told of his impending suffering, death, and resurrection. Peter felt that wasn't right, and he believed that he heard from God, and Peter rebuked Jesus. We can infer that if Peter was bold enough to rebuke Jesus, he was confident that God told him what was right and that Jesus was wrong. Where it all broke down was that Peter was far too confident in his ability to hear from God. "Get behind me, Satan." This was a strong rebuke from Jesus, yet entirely appropriate. Though a moment before Peter spoke as a messenger of God, he then spoke as a messenger of Satan. Jesus knew there was a satanic purpose in discouraging him from his ministry on the cross, and Jesus would not allow that purpose to succeed. We can be sure that Peter was not aware that he spoke for Satan, just as a moment before he was not aware that he spoke for God. It is often much easier to be a tool of God or of the devil than we want to believe. Jesus said, "You are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of man." Jesus exposed how Peter came into this satanic way of thinking. He didn't make a deliberate choice to reject God and embrace Satan. He simply let his mind settle on the things of men instead of the things of God, and Satan took advantage of it. Peter is a perfect example of how a sincere heart, coupled with man's thinking, can often lead to disaster. You can be sincere in your thinking, but be sincerely wrong. Yeah, sincerity is not enough. If anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It was bad enough for the disciples to hear that Jesus would suffer, be rejected, and die on the cross. Now Jesus told them that they had to do the same thing. Everybody knew what Jesus meant when he said this. Everyone knew that the cross was an unrelenting instrument of death. The cross had no other purpose. The cross wasn't about religious ceremonies. It wasn't about traditions and spiritual feelings. The cross was a way to execute people. In these 20 centuries after Jesus, we sanitized and ritualized the cross. How would we receive it if Jesus said, "Walk down death row daily and follow me"? Taking up your cross wasn't a journey. It was a one-way trip. Cross-bearing does not refer to some irritation in life. Rather, it involves the way of the cross. The picture is of a man already condemned, required to carry his cross on the way to the place of execution, as Jesus was required to do. For whoever desires to lose his life, whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. We must follow Jesus this way because it is the only way that we will ever find life. It sounds strange to say you will never live until you walk down death row with Jesus, but that is the idea. You can't gain resurrection life without dying first. You don't lose a seed when you plant it, though it seems dead and buried. Instead, you set the seed free to be what it was always intended to be. Yeah. And that's what the picture of baptism is supposed to be. A dying to the old and a rebirth of the new. Into the new, more. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Avoiding the walk down death row with Jesus means that we may gain the whole world and end up losing everything. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed. If Jesus Christ had come into the world as a mighty and opulent man, clothed with earthly glories and honors, he would have had a multitude of partisans, and most of them hypocrites. Jesus is coming again in glory, and if we will rebel against the world, the flesh and the devil, we will share in the glory. Most people think of following Jesus as conforming to the establishment. Actually, Jesus called us to rebel against the established order of this world. We are called to rebel against the tyranny of the flesh, against the fear and conformity of the world, against the traditions of man. Jesus encourages a slave rebellion, where the slaves of sin, Satan, and the world rebel against their masters. Yeah, and some standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God present with power. Walking with Jesus doesn't just mean a life of death and crosses, it also means a life of the power and glory of the kingdom. Yeah, and immediately after this you have the transfiguration of Jesus, a very visible showing of the coming of the kingdom. Psalm 42, verses 1 through 11. As a deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, for the living God. I say, when will I be able to go and appear in God's presence? I cannot eat. I weep day and night, all day long. They say to me, where is your God? I will remember and weep, for I was once walking along with the great throng to the temple of God, shouting and giving thanks along with the crowd as we celebrated the holy festival. Why are you depressed, O my soul? Why are you upset? Wait for God, for I will again give thanks to my God for his saving intervention. I am depressed, so I will pray to you while I am trapped here in the region of the upper Jordan, from Hermon, from Mount Mizar. One deep stream calls out to another at the sound of your waterfalls. All your billows and waves overwhelm me. By day the Lord decrees his loyal love, and by night he gives me a song, a prayer to the living God. I will pray to God, my high ridge. Why do you ignore me? Why must I walk around mourning because my enemies oppress me? My enemies' taunts cut into me to the bone as they say to me all day long, where is your God? Why are you depressed, O my soul? Why are you upset? Wait for God, for I will again give thanks to my God for a saving intervention. Yeah, it is a good reminder for us when we're depressed and downcast, to wait for God, for his continued faithfulness to us. And finally, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 17. He is in the way of life that keepeth, it's in King James Version. The one who heeds instruction is on the way to life, but the one who rejects rebuke goes astray. Yeah, important to heed instruction. Otherwise, it's very easy to be on the path of death, and sometimes physical death and sometimes spiritual death. Anywho, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.